Hello, my name is Jacob, and this is a very short introduction to Git.
Next level.
So what is Git? Git is a version control tool, sometimes also called SCM, so Source Code Management Tool, and it was created originally by Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux, in 2005 when the tool they used at the time stopped being free to use. Git allows you to create snapshots of your project and keep track of what is in that snapshot, when was it created, and who created that snapshot, which is then super useful for tracking the history and how a project progressed. One thing that a lot of people get wrong in the mental model is how Git keeps track of changes. The fact that it doesn't, right? Git doesn't keep track of changes, it keeps track of whole snapshots at a point in time, and we can then view the changes that have happened by inspecting 2 or more snapshots. All of these snapshots, which are then called commits in Git, are then kept track of in a so-called repository. So a repository is the scope in which Git keeps track of changes. Normally what you will see is you will have one repository per project. So if you have, for example, a native app and that one talks to a backend API, you might have one repository for the native app's code and one repository for the backend code. Sometimes companies do use something called a monorepo. In that case, all of the code for all of the components of a big system would live in the same repository, but it is a bit more rare, and the first approach is what you will more often see. This scope is then on your computer expressed by a single directory. So one single directory will have the .git folder in it. This marks it as a repository, and then everything within that folder, well, with the exception of things that we put in gitignore, but we'll get to that later, will be tracked by this one repository. The next thing to understand is how Git keeps track of changes made to a single file. By default, Git differentiates between untracked and tracked files, where the tracked files can be in effectively 3 different stages, which are unmodified, modified, and staged. When you create a new file that Git doesn't know about yet, it's going to be untracked, right? So it says, hey, I see a file in my directory, but you have not told me to keep track of any changes for this one, so I consider it untracked. If you want to tell Git to now track this file, you can do that by using the git add command, which will add it to the repository. The file at this point in time will then be staged with all of its content. If you make further modifications to a staged file, it will then go to modified. And you can go back and forth by this. You can add a file repeatedly, always telling Git to stage it, and then make modifications until you then use git commit to create a new commit, or how we called them earlier, also snapshots. At this point in time, Git will write a new entry to the history, it will create a new snapshot, and then it will consider that file unmodified. And then the whole cycle repeats again. Alright, before we go any deeper, let's check out what all of that we have learned of so far looks like in practice. I have a terminal open here. I have Git installed. If you haven't Git installed yet, go to git-scm.com. You can download it there for your operating system. And then you can just use Git here, and it's gonna give you the help list, then you know you have it installed. The first thing I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna create a new directory here. I'm gonna call this a very short introduction to Git, and I'm gonna change into this directory. A great command to know is the git status command, which gives you the status of a repository. So if you try this out here right now, it's telling us fatal, not a Git repository, and that kind of makes sense, right? We just created an empty directory. How should that just be a repository? But we can make it a repository by using the git init command. And now it's telling us it has initialized an empty Git repository at this path. It is also here, my satchel is also telling me that I'm on the main branch. We haven't talked about branches yet. We don't need to worry about it too much right now. What we care about are the files. So if you use git status right now, it's telling us basically on branch main, no commits yet, nothing to commit. So let's create a file and then we can see what it looks like. So if we say touch a.text and then use git status, then now it's telling us, hey, I have detected an untracked file, right? And that's what we talked about earlier, where we said if git doesn't know about a file yet, it will find it in its repository. It will tell you that it is untracked, but it's not gonna commit changes made to that file to a commit by default. So one thing that we can do is we can say git add a.text and then check out the status again. And now it's telling us changes to be committed. And this is the stage that we talked about. You remember the thing on the very right? So we have now moved it from untracked to staged. And we also said we can make modifications and then edit and be in staged again. So we can use whatever text editor you like. We can say hello world, for example, and then write those changes. And if we now use git status, this is quite interesting. Now it's listing this file twice. It's one saying changes to committed, and then also changes not staged for commit. And this is because, as we said, Git keeps kind of like track of snapshots, and it works similar for files. So we said git add dot when this file was empty, and now we have modified it. So in the stage we have the empty file, and in the modified area we have the line we just added. And we can look at this by using git diff. And we can see here, hey, we have modified a.text, and we added one line. It's telling us here with the plus that we have added this line, hello world. So we can now move that modified chunk back into staged by again using git add a.text. And if we check out the status, now we're back to it just being green and saying this will be committed. So let's do that. Let's commit this change. I'm gonna say here adds a.text. And if you remember from just right now, it will now make a commit, keep track of everything that we have told it to keep track of, which right now is only one file, and it's gonna consider that file unmodified. And we can check that out by using git status again, and it's telling us here, nothing to commit, working tree is clean. So this is exactly what we talked when we said the file is unmodified. And we also said we can now modify the file again and start this whole cycle again. So if we say, okay, here, this is a new line of text with some modifications. That's not how you spell some. And we now use git status. It is again telling us, hey, you have modified that file and they're not staged for committing yet. So we can again do a git add a.text, move it into staged. We can check that that is actually the case, and it is. Changes to be committed, and we can commit a second time, adds some more text to a.text. And now we have a second commit, and our file is considered unmodified again. And as I said, you do that over and over, and that's how you keep track of single files and changes to single files. One thing I'm going to show you right here in the terminal is how to tell Git to ignore certain files. This can be especially useful if you have artifacts like your build artifacts or dependencies that you don't want to add to your source control, because they can be reproduced by either running the build or by downloading all of your dependencies. For example, if you're using JavaScript, by using like npm install. So just to recap, if we look at git status here, we currently have a very clean state, and we can check what we have in our current repository. And there's only one file called a.text. So let's say we have a file that is in a build folder, so like some artifact. One thing I'm going to show you right here in the terminal is how to tell Git to ignore certain files. This is super useful when you have build artifacts or, for example, downloaded dependencies that are managed through a dependency manager. So for example, if a JavaScript project, you use npm, and when you run npm install, it puts everything in this like node modules folder. And that can be recreated easily by running npm install, so you don't need to put this in your repository. Or as I said, when you build your project and you have built artifacts, those can be recreated by just running your build steps. So let's have a quick look at what we have right now. We have one file, a.txt, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a new file in right here in vim.b.txt, right? And we say we want to ignore this file. So if we currently check out status, it is telling us, hey, you have an untracked file here, right? And one thing that we can do is we could make changes to A and our other files, and then make sure we don't add b.txt. But that is super annoying because there's a super nifty way to add all files, and that is using git add dot. And that would now add b.txt to our stage, and we want to ignore b.txt. So Git comes with a built-in way of dealing with this, and that is the gitignore file. So if we create a .gitignore all in one case, and this dot here is very important, file, then we can write here files that we wanted to ignore, for example, b.txt. And if we now check at the status, we see that b.txt is gone, but we now have a new file, the gitignore file, and that file we want to add to our repository. So we can do that by saying git add .gitignore, or as I said, with just dot, and that will be all the files in this directory and subdirectories. And right now we would have added gitignore, and we don't have to worry about b.txt, even though it still exists here in our local directory. And we can do the same with directories as well. So let's say we have this node modules directory, and we're gonna add some file in here, like let's say touch some lib.js, and list this out. We now have a node modules file, right? If we look at this, we have a.txt, b.txt, and then node modules with some lib.js. And we don't want to have to add some lib and some other lib, etc., etc., etc. So what we can do is, right now, if we look at this, it says untracked files, node modules. We can add this whole directory to our gitignore. So if we do gitignore, add a new line, say node modules slash, and then use git status. It now has removed node modules from untracked files. So the whole directory and all the files within are now gone, and we don't have to worry about them. All we now need to do again is stage and then commit the changes to the gitignore file itself. So let's do that. It's gitignore file. And there you go. That's how you tell Git how to ignore files and directories that you don't want to keep track of. Now you know how to keep track of changes and record commits on your local machine. But what Git is really, really good for is to collaborate with other people on your projects. The way we normally collaborate using Git is through so-called remote repositories. Remote repositories are hosted on a Git service or server. Most of the time people now use SaaS providers like GitHub or GitLab. There are many others out there, but most of the time you will find stuff on GitHub. The remote repository is a full copy of your local repository, right? So that means by them being full copies is they can evolve independently from each other. Therefore, when you don't have an internet connection, or you're just like in the groove, you're working, committing, you can do that all on your local repository. And then once you're happy with all of the changes and all of the commits that you have made, you can go and push those changes to the remote repository. Now, someone who might be collaborating with you can now go and pull the changes that you have pushed and then themselves add more and more commits to the history and again push them back, right? So this is fantastic because it means everyone has all of the code at that point in time when they last pulled, and everyone can work independently from each other, and then you synchronize those changes whenever you want to. What if you have done some work locally and you would like to back that up by pushing it to the server, but you're not ready yet for them to be shared with other people? And that's where branches come into play. Branches are different streams of commits in your repository. So we've already seen a branch earlier, which was the main branch. That's the default branch that is created when you initialize a new Git repository. If you don't change anything around that setup and you just commit, then those commits will be on the main branch. So the main branch will evolve with every single commit. Now, if you're not ready yet to share your changes, you can create a new branch with a name that is meaningful to you, or like meaningful in the terms of the project, and you can write commits against that branch. And that means that the histories of main and your branch can effectively diverge, and whenever you're ready, you can then merge your changes back into main. And that's basically all that branches really are for. Alright, let's have a look at this in practice. We are back at where we left off before. We have a clean status, and one command that we haven't looked at before is git log, and I'm going to use the graph option here, which is going to give us this nice little dots here that we can work with. So in order to create a new branch, you can either use git branch, or if you want to switch to the new branch and create it at the same time, you can say git switch -c for create, and then which branch you want. So we can just call this a branch. Alright, now says we switch to a new branch, and if we look at our graph again, we can see here that this head is basically telling us which branch we're on. We're pointing at a branch, and we're also main. So currently our two branches are at the same point in our history. Now let's just create a new file, add this, and then commit it. It's new file c.text. Now if we look at our history again, we can see that main has stayed on the commit that it was on previously, and now branch has a new commit on it, the one I've just written. It's new file c.text. So those two are now in different states. This means if we look at currently what we have in this one here, a, b, and c.text, and if we now switch back to main and we look at the files, our c.text is gone, and that is because it only exists on the a branch. Now you can switch between branches as much as you want, so we can switch back to a branch. Let's say we make another commit, so let's touch d.text. Add this, commit it, it's new file d.text. And look at the graph. We now have two commits on our a branch, and main again still hasn't changed. Now when you're ready, you can merge these changes into main. The easiest way to do that is by going back to main and now using git merge. So you're telling Git to merge changes from a branch into main. So we say git merge a branch. So you can think of this as like, hey, merge the changes from a branch into the one I'm currently on, and that is main. Now in this case, because we haven't made any changes to main, it says this was a fast forward branch. So that means it just effectively like has moved main to where a branch was before, because there was nothing to like merge in with each other. And that's like most straightforward merge you will encounter, the fast forward one. You don't really have to worry too much about other merges at the moment, as this is kind of a bit out of scope for your first play arounds with Git. So yeah, you now know how to create branches, how to switch branches. And one thing that I want to show you now is how to work a little bit with remote repositories. So I have created a new repository here on GitHub, and there is nothing in it right now. It's a completely empty repository. But what it is telling me is like the URL to that repo. So what I can do is I can grab this one and I can add this as a remote repository to my current one. And I can do this by using git remote add. Then I need to give it a name and what is origin. Origin is the kind of like standard that you name your remote repositories. And then the URL to it. So we are adding a new remote repository with the name origin, which lives at that point. In order to do that with GitHub, you need to be signed in. There is like a GitHub CLI. GitHub has fantastic documentation on how to do that. I'm not going to show this here. So what we can do now is we can now git push main. And now it says here, branch main set up a new track to origin main, and it pushed a new branch, and then it pushed it to github.com/jadusberger/ a very short introduction to Git. If we look at our graph here now, we see we have a new branch here, which is the origin/main branch. So these are remote branches, and they tell us where origin is currently at. So the good thing is that main is where origin is, or origin is where main is. So currently they have not diverged at all. And if we switch over to here and we refresh this page, we can see our files and we can see all of our commits. Now, just to quickly show you what it looks like when you create a new commit, let's go here, make some changes to a file, some new changes. Add dot. So we can now see that we have modified this file, git commit this m, makes some changes to a.text. And if we now look at our log again, we can see that our local main has changed, but origin has not, right? So that's what I meant earlier when I said you can work locally, you can commit locally as much as you want, and then whenever you're ready, you can sync those changes back. And to prove that to you, we can go here and we look at a.text, and we can see that this line is not here yet, right? Because we haven't pushed our changes. So now let's do that, git push. It's now telling us that it has updated main from this commit to that commit. And now when we refresh here, we have the changes we just pushed. And that's the most basic workflow for using remote repositories with Git. Amazing. You now know how to initialize a new repository, how to add files to Git, make commits, ignore files that you don't want in your repository, how to create and switch between branches, and how to pull and push from a remote repository. These are all the basics really that you will need for day-to-day working with Git. So go on, try it out, and I hope you enjoy using Git.